Welcome to Saturdays at 7, Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. My name is Todd Ream. I have the privilege of serving as the publisher for Christian Scholars Review and as the host for Saturdays at 7. I also have the privilege of serving on the faculty and the administration at Indiana Wesleyan University. Our guest is John Witte, Jr., the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of Law, the McDonald Distinguished Professor, and the faculty director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You earned a bachelor's degree from Calvin College and a Juris Doctorate from Harvard University. At what point did you become aware that your sense of vocation had something to do with the practice of religion and the practice of religion as it intersected with the law?
I think it came during my early college days. I went to Calvin College, now called Calvin University, a strong, religiously inspired interdisciplinary institution. I studied history, philosophy, and biology. I was contemplating medical school, law school, or graduate school, and I began to realize that my real interest lay in the Reformation period initially, focused on what happened with this transformation of theology of church-state relations and more, and began to realize that that had both deep theological as well as legal dimensions and political dimensions to it. And my interest began to focus there philosophically and historically. I continued to think about the vocation of medicine, but I realized that my gifts, such as they were studying this interaction of law and religion, first in the Reformation period and looking backward and forward from there.
Were any individuals particularly influential in your understanding of your vocation as a legal scholar?
Calvin as a whole was deeply influential in underscoring the importance of finding one's vocation with whatever talents God has given us. And that was a constant message that we received as young scholars. I had the privilege of working with Evan Runner, who was a charismatic philosophy professor in the philosophy department and was very strong on finding one's vocation. I also worked with Nick Waltersdorf and George Marsden, the Van Clay brothers in the history department, and others. And all of them had a very strong emphasis on both experimenting with different genre of scholarship, focusing on areas where one felt one's talents were best deployed, giving me the leisure of writing directed studies and other things that otherwise weren't available in courses. And Rudder in particular was very kind to tutor me for a year in studying the history of Western legal philosophy from Homer to Hegel. And he ran me through all the old sources all the way through to the 19th century, and then the semester ran out. But it was a wonderful opportunity to try out in a number of different settings where my vocation lay.
Of those texts that you read then at that time or since, were any of them more influential on you than others?
Well, it was the great books reading, so it's very hard it's very hard to pick out any one of them that's particularly influential. But if you read some of these classics from Greek and Roman times, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Seneca, read some of the great Roman law texts that emerged both before and after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, read some of the great church fathers I found particularly inspiring, Chrysostom and Augustine, and then marching through the tradition. Hincmar of Reims became an important figure, Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and the march into early modern Protestantism. It was a rich diet of material, Runner in particular, but all the scholars whom I mentioned were very emphatic on the need to read primary sources unfiltered by secondary literature and develop the textual skills and the discernment process of understanding the letter and spirit of those contributions. And I found that reading period for a year and the whole 4-year experience at Calvin College deeply formative in getting the attention to the core texts. And I have spent the rest of my career going back to them intermittently with new questions in mind.
Yeah, wonderful education. Finally, I want to ask if any particular experiences proved influential in terms of your development of your vocation.
Well, going to Harvard Law School was particularly providential for me. I had still struggled between graduate school and history or philosophy. I also took the MCAT and got into medical school and trying to decide on different law schools. And I took the occasion to write to professor at Harold J. Berman at Harvard Law School, who had been working in the law and religion field in the prior 25 years. I'd read a lot of his stuff. And I just wrote to him out of the blue as a 21-year-old punk coming into Calvin College and asked him what he thought should be the best path I should follow. And this was a great, great man at Harvard Law School, been there since 1948, was a convert to Christianity from Judaism, one of the great people in legal history. And he took the time 3 days after receiving my letter to write a 2-page letter back, whose principal instruction that I remember was, come study with me. And I took that occasion as a door opening to work with him. And I sat at his feet literally for 40 hours a week as a research assistant while going to school full time. We worked together intensely over the next 25 years, first in my completing my degree, and then Berman, out of the blue, decided to go to this place called Emory University in Atlanta and take a Woodruff chair. And one of the perks of the chair was for a young fellow to come with him, and that was I. And so I went as a stowaway in his briefcase, joined the faculty a couple of years later, and was able to build with Berman, a field of law and religion studies, and been doing that ever since. I saw that as really divine intervention, because one could get a degree from Harvard and go practice law and make a fortune, but not really feel vindicated in one's vocation. So that was really, for me, very formative. And Berman was a great colleague and mentor. We worked together intensely over the years.
To be able to hold the chair that someone who meant that much to you and did that much in terms of shaping your sense of vocation must be a real privilege and honor then.
Yeah, it really was a wonderful divine pat on the back, is how I took it, to be appointed by the president to this university professorship, and to have the privilege of continuing the work that he had trailblazed at Emory, and to now have the privilege of starting to mentor the next generation. I've been teaching for nearly 38 years now. I've taught 10,000 plus students, and a number of them have gone on to distinguished academic careers and legal careers and judicial careers. And it's just wonderful to kind of watch that next generation coming along. And I'm trying to do a bit of the pay forward that Berman did for me, and to do that for the next generation. A number of wonderful Christian law students in particular who have come and worked with me over the years, and that's been deeply gratifying.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. Your expertise includes legal history, human rights, religious freedom, marriage and family law, law and religion, and legal theory. What connective thread, if any, runs through these areas of expertise?
Well, it shows a inability to focus in on one thing, but what holds them together is the three things that people will die for: their faith, their freedom, and their family. And what I have found to be my vocation is to engage deeply those three questions separately and together, to look at them historically, comparatively, legally, theologically, and to spend time looking at how those fundamental questions still divide us and unite us in 21st century culture. Each of the buckets that I have worked in has been a separate area of interest and expertise, such as it is. But what holds them together is really this passion of trying to get to the heart of fundamental aspects of human life and human society, and human living, and human aspiration. And I see those three F's of faith, freedom, and family as the organic tie amongst them.
Yeah. Of all the questions then that you pursued that came out of those three domains then, is there one question perhaps, or maybe two or three, that you've returned to with greater frequency than others?
I'd say one clearly is the fundamental place, role, responsibility of marriage and family life, and the need for us to continue to recognize that most organic institution set out in the created order and fundamental to any organized society. I've been deeply, deeply engaged by trying to understand sex, marriage, and family, trying to understand parental roles and rights and responsibilities, children's place in the home, the importance of the form and the function of marriage and family life as it gets buffeted in different periods, including in our day. That's been one question of deep import for me, and especially as we watch the culture wars over those questions dividing us at our family level, in our churches, in our societies, trying to situate modern debates in a 3,000-year tradition of thought is an important question for me. I think a second one clearly is this fundamental gift that we have of freedom that is part of our basic created order that is constantly besieged by those who would betray it or to abridge it at least, and the need to ground freedom and attendant rights and liberties claims to be able to find the structures of authority and liberty that allow for a happy harmony between the exercise of one's liberty and the need for a well-ordered society, working through the constitutional and cultural mechanisms by which that has been done over the centuries. That's a second really important question for me. And related to that is a third perennial one, which is how do church and state get along? How do we think about these two most fundamental institutions in society alongside the family? And how do we construct relationships of both semi-autonomy, of cooperation, of collaboration, of assurance that each discharges its own fundamental responsibility while being sensitive to the sovereignty of the other sphere? I mean, those are deep, deep constitutional questions that have confronted religious communities around the world from the beginning, but are fundamental to the 2,000-year history of the Western and Eastern churches. And the variety of ways by which we've constructed theologically and legally the appropriate relationships of church and state as a third question of deep import for me in ongoing engagement.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're the author or editor of more than 45 books. Are any of those books more reflective or definitive of your thinking, perhaps, than any of the others?
Speaking among your children, I guess. I mean, I believe in justification by faith alone, but I like to have a backup plan, and all these works are there in part to provide same before they send me to the left gate on the day of judgment, facetiously. I think that each of the areas in which I work has a favorite text or two. One of the early books that I did was called Law and Protestantism, The Legal Teachings of the Lutheran Reformation, 2002 title, where I, for the first time, engaged very deeply what the Reformation had to say about public, private, penal, procedural law, legal theory, political theory, constitutional structures, church-state relations, and the like. That was a deep, organic book, took a long time to write, took the ironic posture of looking at the Lutheran Reformation, which Throsch and others had always said was a sectarian rather than a much more engaged form of Protestantism, and tried to show that actually the Lutheran Reformation was both a theological and a legal Reformation. And I've had a series of subsequent works in the Reformation field to continue to demonstrate that thesis in other denominational settings, mostly early modern. I think a second important book is called From Sacrament to Contract. That was an early organic book that tried to tell audaciously in 300 pages a 3,000-year history of marriage, family, sexuality, theology, and law in the Western tradition. An outrageously superficial book in one sense, but also a book that was designed to be a sketch and to try to provide some kind of modeling of how church, state, and family got along over the tradition. And I try to juxtapose sacramental, covenantal, social, commonwealth, and contractarian models in that book. I've developed 2 or 3 different editions of that and iterations of that since then. But that early book, commissioned from a project at University of Chicago run by Don Browning and Martin Marty, was a very important shaping book for me to both focus on the Reformation, but then to radiate backward and forward from the Reformation's contributions to marriage and family life and the law and theology that govern it. And I guess a third one would be called The Reformation of Rights, which is a history of Calvinist rights talk from the 16th to the 18th century. To what extent did this Reformed tradition help shape what we call rights and liberties today, and to what extent were some of its theologically grounded teachings on rights and liberties and attendant constitutional structures, to what extent does that theologically grounded vision still have a place in the 21st century? Part of this was an answer to secularists that would prefer to see that rights emerged out of the Enlightenment as a rebuke of the Christian tradition, and this was an attempt to say, to the contrary, the Enlightenment lived off much of the capital that the Protestant Reformation and Catholic counter-reformations had produced. And part of it was a rebuke to some of my Calvinist brethren and sisterhood who say that rights are simply a betrayal of the fundamental teachings of the Reformed tradition and a product of the Enlightenment, and to say, no, actually, the rights and liberties that you think are prodigal today, nonetheless, are our children. We produced a good number of them, theologically grounded as we did, and it's time to retrieve and reconstruct that tradition. That was a hard book to write, a fun book to write, and in many ways is an anchor for an ongoing set of stories about how rights and liberties in the Western tradition are grounded. And I'm working on the sequel to that book now that takes the 18th to 21st century story forward, and working on a lot of other aspects of rights and liberties history from antiquity till today. Those are three of the early children that I'm still very happy about, and all the other books I don't want to eclipse by singling those out. But each one of these is a wonderful privilege to kind of engage a big body of literature, do deep research and writing, and then lay out your findings, inevitably leaving most of the findings on the floor, the cutting floor, when you're finally done.
The inevitable experience of working with an editor with a sharp eye. So, yeah, thank you.
Yep, exactly right.
You write and edit books in any number of areas at one time, and I just have to ask, what habits of mind have you forged that allow you to track with those respective efforts and stay engaged with them?
Part of it is having an organic tie amongst them. So the faith, freedom, and family organic tie, recognizing that these are corners of different of the same canvas rather than new canvases that you're turning. Part of it is I always find that, like scientific experiments, oftentimes it's the byproduct of the experiment rather than the actual intent of the experiment that is the most interesting result. And I find oftentimes when I'm writing deeply in one area, that triggers by analogy or sometimes completely unrelated thoughts about another area. And thank the Lord for split screens these days, because I've been doing a good bit of split screening. I find myself oftentimes when I have a good deeply creative day, I find myself oftentimes working on 3 or 4 projects at the same time because I keep flipping from one to the other. Some of that's dilettantism, to be sure, but some of it's also just the creativity that emerges when you're deeply focused. And I try to take advantage of that when it comes along. And the habits are, I try to write for a few hours every day and start with the thing that's most important to get out because there's a due date. But often I find myself breaching my due dates because I've been stimulated to work on something that doesn't have as much pressing import on my schedule, but it has, pressing import on my mind.
Thank you. I want to transition now to talking about your offering as a Gifford lecturer. In 2022, you delivered the first of 5 bicentenary lectures. The stated purpose of the Gifford lectures is for promoting, advancing, teaching, and diffusing the study of natural theology. And the title for your lecture was A New Calvinist Reformation of Rights. Would you please start by offering some details concerning your response to receiving the invitation to serve as a Gifford lecturer?
Yeah, it was a wonderful occasion to be invited to give that august lecture series, be part of that august lecture series and participate, especially in the bicentennial, for a guy who's working in law to be included in that kind of theology, humanities world was, I took it as a pat on the back from on high to say, your work is having an impact in the religion world too, and thank you for that. Since natural theology was part of the conversation that the Gifford Lectures was trying to sponsor, I wanted to work on some of the natural rights and natural law discussions that the Protestant tradition had contributed. We got postponed twice in the COVID era, so we got pressed into a much more confined presentation than would have been warranted in the day. And so I just focused in on one story in that ongoing modern or early modern to modern Calvinist contribution to rights talk, which was a story of James Pennington, an escaped slave who became one of the great Presbyterian advocates for abolitionism and became, in fact, president of the World Abolition Society. And on the strength of deep Calvinist premises and on the strength of constitutional order and natural law theologies that inspired that constitutional order in America, made a very strong case for abolitionism. And telling his story, which is virtually unknown to the non-specialist, was a special treat. after two years of waiting, it became less special because Pennington has, in the interim, been discovered by friends at Heidelberg and Yale, where he had a special place. And by reason of that, the contribution was a little less novel than I would have hoped, but nonetheless, well-received, wonderful hosts, and it was a special time in my life and my wife's life, who was there to exercise censorship to the extent it was needed.
As spouses are often helpful in doing, yes. Would you please offer a few details concerning your hope about the lasting influence of that lecture? What do you hope that it left with audience members? And then I think you've already echoed in some ways that it's currently at work in efforts that you're currently leading.
Yeah, one of the nice things about the Gifford lectures is, by reason of their distinction, they tend to be used a good bit by subsequent generations. And nowadays, with audiovisual capacities, there are different ways you can consume them even before the lectures are published. My hope is that people can see that threefold, I guess. One is that the Calvinist tradition is not averse to natural law and natural rights or human rights that emerge from the same. To the contrary, it tends to be exemplary in many instances in the pre-18th century period, certainly, and even into the 19th century, when anti-naturalism and anti-rights discussions began to become more and more prominent in the Calvinist tradition. The second thing I hope people would take from this is that there are many new things under the sun and under rocks and buried in archives, and being alert to the important stewardship responsibilities that we have as historians, especially to look at the deposit of the tradition and to recognize that there are many, many contributions that have been lost on modern scholarship and need to be both rediscovered and reconstructed and re-engaged is, I think, part of the reason for picking up what otherwise might be viewed as a kind of arcane story. And the third, I guess, is in a day when the country on this side of the Atlantic, but both in the UK as well, is roiled with debates about race and debates about religion and debates about violence. Here we have in James Pennington, the subject of my lecture, a remarkable exemplar of a guy who emerges from the ravages of slavery and the brutality that he faced and his family faced, who develops 150 years before the Civil Rights Movement a Calvinist theory of rights and resistance, but nonviolent resistance, and works out a really, really interesting, comprehensive theology and philosophy and I would say jurisprudence of rights that has an awful lot to teach us today, and does it without the bitterness that attends some of the discussions of race relationships today, does it in a way that both prophetically engages, but also sympathetically adduces the power of the church to be an important voice for rights, an important advocate for removal of rights violations. He struck me as here's a guy doing a Black Lives Matter movement a century and a half before his time, and with a level of faith and fervency and patience, perseverance that it would be nice to see in our 21st century culture sometimes.
Yeah. Someone whose example certainly merits great consideration and perhaps even emulating in a number of ways today. Thank you. I want to transition to talking about your perception of the academic vocation as you've understood it and as you've exercised it. And would you start simply by offering your assessment and understanding of the Christian academic vocation?
I come at this as an old-fashioned Protestant who starts with the idea of vocation, and that each of us is given a set of talents, and we're called to exercise those talents in the vocation that seems best fit to the talents we've been given and meets the opportunities that are there for us to discharge the other things that we have in life, not least our care for our faith and freedom and family. The academic vocation is one of them, and it is important that those who come into the academic vocation as believers, Christian believers in particular, recognize that that vocation has certain metes and bounds that are part of it, expectations, methodologies, literatures that are to be engaged, and that it is important to master the vocation as it's defined for us. If you're an historian, you be an historian. If you're a mathematician, you be a mathematician. If you're an architect, you be an architect. And it is important to not to simply walk in and say, because you're a Christian, therefore you're exempt from some of the basic canons and methodologies of your discipline. That said, the Christian academic vocation, as I see it, has beyond its responsibility of vindicating the highest ideals of that vocation, has also the responsibility of injecting, emphasizing, exemplifying the deep religious foundations, dimensions, sources of the particular vocation the person is in. I'm an old enough Calvinist and a Calvin College graduate to think that God's created order, God's life and spirit are at work in everything that we do. And by reason of that, we have a responsibility to echo that as God's image bearers and ambassadors. And so in the legal academic vocation that I have, it is to be a great law professor and to take care of your students and to teach excellent classes and to do scholarship, but then also find ways of teaching and doing scholarship and engaging the legal profession in a manner that allows you to serve God, the church, and God's people. And in my case, it's to retrieve and reconstruct the wisdom of our own Christian tradition with respect to law and politics. It's also to emphasize in classes on religious freedom or history of church-state relations in the West or history of law, religion, and family, to emphasize how critical a deep theological tradition like Christianity can offer to the fundamental questions of law, politics, and society, and then to debate with the students some of the hard questions that they encounter around First Amendment issues or around marriage and family issues, and to equip them to forensically engage the debates and participate authentically in contributing to them.
Thank you. What unique challenges, if any, then come when one's vocation intersects or exists at the intersection between law and religion, as you've described?
There are different kinds of competitions. I mean, one of them is an old adage going back to Luther that lawyers are bad Christians. And the notion that Juristen böse Christen, as Luther said famously, echoing an adage in the tradition. But that idea is still there, I think, in pious Protestant and sometimes Catholic circles too, that oftentimes you betray an awful lot of your own faith by entering into a profession that sometimes is typified by its grubbiness, by its greed, by its cavalier attitude toward truth and truth-seeking. It doesn't have to be that, but that certainly is one kind of caricature that one faces as a person of faith going into law. And I spend time with my students trying to talk about what a prophet, priest, and king needs to be in the legal profession, and that's been deeply meaningful. I think a second thing that I face, especially as a law and religion guy, is inevitable skepticism about what I'm doing in a law school teaching this stuff. Some people view this as proselytizing Christianity. Some people view this as introducing a soft, in-app subject into legal studies. Some will worry deeply that we're distracting students from the fundamental preparation that they need to be good lawyers. And facing those epistemological headwinds is a normal part of my day-to-day life. I think it's a healthy part because it keeps you from being complacent. And it forces you constantly to be in the position of being careful not to use the classroom lectern as a mode of proselytism. Your private office hours are, but not in the classroom. It is important for you to show that religion is a critical dimension of law, politics, and society, and its understanding and interdisciplinary engagement helps rather than hurts the legal profession. And it's important, I think, also to show that law is a universal solvent of human living, and that to be understood properly, it needs to be understood in conversation and in concert with many other of our basic disciplines in life. And that literature and philosophy and politics and all the other humane and social sciences, together with religion, are part of different windows on the legal profession and ways of helping understand law and the legal profession's responsibility in law, rather than distractions from core legal education.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, as you've described, I've often thought that in relation to almost any discipline or profession for which one seeks training and expertise in the academy today, that there's a certain amount of amnesia that we often have about the history that has brought these disciplines or professions into existence. And thus our knowledge of them and the changes that they will undergo, even in our lifetime, is quite thin and doesn't serve us nor our students as well as we need to be prepared to do so. We're to shepherd them over the course of our lifetimes.
Yeah, I think that's a keen insight, and it's often striking how novel it is for people to hear that for centuries, until well into the 19th century, the three great divisions of the Western University were law, theology, and medicine. Mm-hmm. And one learned those three professions separately and together, and they were the kind of core foundation for the learned life. And increasingly, one of the stories of the 19th and 20th century, as you know better than I, is the increased kind of specialization and disciplinary positivism that begins to emerge, and these hermetic and then eventually hermeneutical divisions that we start making between departments and divisions and schools, and the consequent narrowing view of what theology means and what the law means in the 20th and 21st century mind. And trying to overcome that is not so easy. If all you are is just one department of knowledge, it's very hard to say that your department of knowledge requires access through a lot of other disciplines. And in turn, if law is simply a technique, one profession that you can pursue alongside dentistry or business or nursing, you've lost some of the majesty of the law and its central place in our ordered life and our constitutional rule of law system that we have today.
Yeah. As a legal scholar, then, what virtues have proven most important for you to cultivate over the course of your lifetime and your career?
I think the usual ones. I think there's, the notion of integrity, of responsibility, of stewardship, of creativity, of discovery, of mentorship, of faithfulness. Those are all basics that I have found to be sine qua nons of success, regardless of what's one's own faith commitment. One of the aspects that's really important, I kind of group under the idea of covenant, which is we tend in the academy to be highly isolated in what we do when we become good specialists. And I think it's really important to recognize is that we are part of a covenant community, and that is organically tied to our forebears who created many of the foundational things on which we build. It's a covenant with the fellow members of the academic and, in my case, legal profession, who are part of a global guild whose presence is essential to the maintenance of a world of law and the protection of faith, freedom, and family. I think covenant also in the sense that we are building something for the next generation, and the responsibility we have of not only stewarding the tradition, but transmitting it, reforming it as necessary, but transmitting it to the next generation. Those are all kind of basics that are, I think, essential to bear in mind, especially when you feel isolated in your own school, or you feel your specialization really has no appreciation or no allies or no analogs. I think it's important to remember that we're part of a deep tradition, which has horizontal and vertical and spatial dimensions to them that I think have to be brought into, have to be part of how we think of ourselves and how we can take comfort when we especially feel buffeted or isolated.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to ask the sort of question in reverse then. What vices, in your estimation, are the most important, perhaps, for legal scholars to confront?
Hubris, I think, is an important one. We tend to think we know everything, and cogency of argument sometimes is viewed as the equivalent of truth. And we have to be careful about recognizing the limitations of what our methodology can offer. Besides hubris, I would say the danger of materialism. Those dangers are deep and real as you enter into a legal profession that's bristling with brass and glass offices and flashy and fashionable people. It's easy to let the glitter beguile you. And I think one of the things that is really important for folk in the legal profession to recognize is not all that is glitters is gold, and not all is golden that glitter. And it's important to keep those together. I think the third thing is distraction from our core mission. We tend in the legal profession to often pursue our client's own self-interest without having the common good in mind. And it's hard to balance the fundamentals of a just legal order and the necessity for catering to the common good with our client's own self-interest, and finding ways of both vindicating our client's interest, but at the same time being responsible citizens is a hard one. I think the fourth thing is monopolization. One of the things that the legal profession can do, and sometimes does do, is it monopolizes your time and energy and focus. And too many lawyers that go into serious work in the field find themselves bereft of their family, isolated because of the hard work that is demanded of them, and put on some of the golden handcuffs that keep them on that treadmill along. That's a mixed metaphor. Put on the golden handcuffs and keep them bound to be pursuing that ongoing life. And I've been teaching long enough now that I have many 40-year-olds wandering back into my office and dressed to the nines, looking very good, wonderfully coiffed, and saying to me, "Professor Witte, I'm absolutely miserable. I've made a fortune. I'm now on my third spouse. I see my kids 3 times a year. I've got a fleet of fancy cars in my garage. I can never use them. And I'm absolutely miserable because I've been caught up in this self-promoting materialist lifestyle, forgetting about what I'm supposed to be doing. And can you give me some advice?" My advice is always the same. Find your vocation and finding it a real sense.
Yeah.
So those are some of the vices that I would be particularly concerned about in the legal profession. I think in the legal academy, I think all of those are in place. We don't have quite the temptations of materialism. We don't have quite the kind of self-defeating behavior because the luxury of tenure lets you basically pursue your ideas. But I think the added danger of tenure is complacency and lack of hunger. When you're no longer driven by a bottom line or by an overarching mandate of your firm or a relentless timesheet demands on you, it is easy to let tenure basically stop your creativity and your pen and make you complacent. And I would say that the academic legal profession has that as a big temptation. And the complacency sometimes can be simply leading a life of leisure, but it also can be you just use your academic platform as a way to engage in consulting or a way to engage in litigation or other things, which are all wonderful things to do. But if your calling is to be a law professor, you got to be a law professor and not use your law professorship as a simple entree into other kinds of pursuits that may be consistent with what the legal profession is about, but not consistent with what the legal teaching profession is.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is running short, but I want to ask one more question, if I may, concerning the church's relationship to the legal vocation. And in particular, what role, if any, should the church play in nurturing current generation of legal scholars and future generations of legal scholars, in your estimation?
Yeah, so you put your finger on a number of things already, which is the trying to instantiate in young congregants and catechumens the idea of vocation and the importance of finding that and recognizing that the legal vocation can be among the things that folk can pursue. I think it's important that the church realizes it is itself a legal entity, and really important for the church to be responsible to the state and responsible to the legal system that it's in, and to recognize that it's not just the exotic religious freedom claims of the First Amendment, but all the hard questions around employment and zoning and other things that go into the creation of an organization that really need to be attended to properly. And I think it's oftentimes viewed as a betrayal of the church's covenant relationship to be involved in thinking about church charters or church employment contracts and things like that. I think it's really important that the church realizes that if and as you do not do those things for yourself, you're going to be subject to the secular authorities and what they might say, and perhaps consistent, perhaps inconsistent with your particular understanding of yourself. I think the church also has an increasingly important responsibility in our 21st century society, not just to preach the word and administer the sacraments and care for the poor and needy and catechize the young, but the church also has a rather important prophetic role, and the prophetic role of speaking truth to power, of speaking against injustice, of not simply acquiescing in a particular political agenda or putting faith in certain kind of princes and not in others. I think those are important lessons for the church to remember. And too often the church has become too complacent with culture, or too willing to hook its divine mission to a particular political platform. And I find that deeply disturbing. And as a historian especially, I can say that never works in the long term. And I think probably in our 21st century society, I think it's also important to realize that the modern welfare state as we know it will not be here in 2 or 3 generations. And the ability for the church to go back to its formative social role in education and charity and in various kinds of engagement with society, consistent with, not as a distraction from its fundamental ministry, but a recognition that so many of the needs of others that the social welfare state has absorbed over the last century are going to increasingly go back to civil society, including the church, to vindicate. The state now is increasingly on the political and the fiscal ropes or ideological ropes about its social welfare responsibilities. This is not a political statement so much as just a prediction that in the next 20, 30 years, we're going to be finding more and more federal, state, and local agencies incapable of delivering on the high promises, especially to the least of these in society. And a church that gets itself ready to legally, politically, culturally, fiscally, to be able to take care of the least of these in society, especially, I think is going to be an increasingly important responsibility. And the more resilient the church in its core mission, the more capable it is of discharging, I think, those increasing emergency functions that are going to come along. And who's going to take care of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren is a question that the church is going to have to face much more frontally now than it will much more frontally in the next 30 years as it does now. And it's a question that's been asked of the church until the turn of the 20th century. So it's not a new question. It simply has to be newly engaged in really responsible institutional ways. And forewarned is forearmed, in my view.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Important matter to consider as the church moves forward. And those of us who serve the church think through what our calling is in terms of how we allocate our time, efforts, and resources. Thank you. Our guest has been John Witte, Jr., the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of Law, the McDonald Distinguished Professor, and the Faculty Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. Thank you for taking the time to share your insights and wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy to be in conversation.
Thank you for joining us for Saturdays at 7. Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. We invite you to join us again next week for Saturdays at 7.